We're continuing in our series now of Reconstruction, where we are examining the events that occurred during Reconstruction as the United States came back together after the Civil War. So we've seen that there have been efforts on the United States government part to try to bring freed slaves into society and give them as many opportunities as possible. While that was happening, we also saw local governments in the South coming up with their own ways to keep freed people at the bottom of the social ladder, because that's just how they wanted to keep things. So we're going to see another system that came about today called sharecropping. So sharecropping was another kind of solution that they tried to come up with for how to provide workers for all this land on the plantations. So once again, those planters or plantation owners need workers. But because slavery has been eliminated, they don't have cash on hand to be able to pay them. Remember that enslaved people were considered property, and property has value. So if you were a plantation owner, a lot of your wealth was wrapped up in your slaves themselves. Like, they were considered your investment. They were your wealth. And so if slavery is now instantly illegal, then all those plantation owners suddenly don't have any wealth, because their wealth was in the form of their property. And in this case, their property was the people who were enslaved under them, right? So they still had the land, however. They just couldn't afford to pay people with the money that they did not have, right? They didn't have any cash. They just had land, because all of their money was wrapped up in the people that now you cannot have slaves, right? So we've got a situation where plantation owners need workers to work their fields. And we also have all these freed people that would like to have jobs, right? They would like to work for wages. And so what they really would actually like is their own land. Like, let them start fresh, let them start over. So sharecropping was a system where the plantation owners would divide their own land into smaller parcels, and they would end up renting land, sometimes to their own former enslaved people. So wouldn't that be kind of funny if you used to work the land as an enslaved person, and then now you're turning around and renting the land from your former slave owner, right? And that would happen in some of these cases where plantation owners would divide their land into smaller plots, and then former slaves could rent the land. But there's a problem with that, because enslaved people didn't necessarily have any money or cash on hand themselves, right? They'd been enslaved their whole life. It's not like they had bank accounts that they could just, pay their first and last month's rent and get going. So they had no money to rent the land. So instead of paying with money, the tenants or the freed slaves would pay their rent by giving a share of their crops to the landowner. Right? So that's where we get the term sharecropping from. You give a share of your crops to then pay rent, right? So this way, the plantation owner wins because they get crops, right, that they can then sell. So they get money. And in this case, the renter or the tenant would also win, because they just have to pay with crops instead of cash. And then what's left over, they can sell on their own, and they can start to make a life there. This is going to work, right? This is a good system, right? We're paying rent by giving a share of our crops to the landowner. So the landowner gets to sell those crops for money. And then you also get to sell your remaining crops for money, and everything's working out. Think again. That's just not quite how it played out. You see, the sharecroppers, the tenants, they had to borrow so many supplies, right? They were starting with Nothing, right? So they had to borrow things like shovels and plows and maybe even livestock. They had to buy seeds in order to be able to plant them. They had no supplies on their own, so they had to borrow those supplies or maybe even get a loan for money from the landowner. And so what happened is they started off their career as a sharecropper, their new career as a farmer, in so much debt because they had to borrow so much just to get started. And they were never able to pay back that debt. So they lived a lifetime of poverty and debt. You see, the landowner would say, well, you owe me this much for rent, but then you also owe me this much for all the debt that you have. And so then the sharecropper would give them the share of crops, and then they'd have no crops left over to sell themselves, right? Because they would end up having to give all of their crops to the landowner just to pay off their own debt. Now, that means that the next harvest, the next season, they're going to have to start from zero again. And they're going to have to go in more debt so they can try to plant again and have a harvest. Now, in agriculture, in farming, if you have a bad year, right, if the weather does something horrible to your crops and you have a low crop, that doesn't change how much you owe the landowner for the land that you're using. So it's not like the landowners were like, oh, this was a really rough year for harvest, so you don't owe me as much this year. Nope, you owed them even more. And so sharecroppers ended up in this endless cycle of poverty because they could never actually pay back the landowner. And so really, it became slavery, but with a different name. You see, when you owe someone so much money, that person essentially owns you, right? Because you're in so much debt to them that you can't get away from it. Something else to keep in mind is there were so many freed slaves that were wanting work that some of the landowners were like, forget you. I'm not going to take care of you. I'm not going to give you any food. I used to take care of you when you were my property, but I'm not going to do it anymore because there's a line of people that would love to come up and work this field. But then if you were kicked off your field, you still owed that debt, right? So people were just in this endless cycle of poverty and debt, and wealthy landowners were still wealthy, and freed slaves were not getting an opportunity to make their way out of poverty, right? It was just this ongoing cycle. So those who used to be enslaved are now in poverty, right? And it's another kind of oppression that's continuing in the South. Now, along with these times came some very derogatory terms. People were name calling each other left and right. So if you really want to stick it to someone, you could call them one of these things. You could call them a scalawag or a carpetbagger. And both of them were naughty, naughty names to call someone in the South during this time. A scalawag was a white person who voted Republican. Now remember, the Republicans at the time were those who were against slavery. So if you were living in the South and you voted Republican, then you were voting against slavery and you were considered a traitor to the Southern way of life. And so they called you a scalawag, right? Then there were carpetbaggers, and carpetbaggers were people from the North who moved to the South after the Civil War. And along with them, they brought their stuff and their things, but also their ideas and their way of thinking. And so as people from the North who were against slavery moved into the South, they started influencing politics and government in the South with their Northern ideas. And so people in the South didn't like that they were being infiltrated by people from the North. So they referred to them as carpetbaggers, this picture of like someone carrying all of their belongings rolled up into a carpet to then move to the South. Basically saying, you don't belong here. We don't want you. You're a carpetbagger. Go back to where you came from. So there was a lot of nastiness in the South during Reconstruction. as people were moving into the South, and as the government was changing and the economy was changing, and people weren't necessarily nice to each other. One thing that also happened was they were coming up with ways to restrict African Americans' rights still. Even though we had the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed full rights as citizens to all people, in the South, they were like, yeah, but there are still some things that African Americans can't do, namely vote. They came up with ways to prevent African Americans from voting. And so the 15th Amendment says, pause, voting is one of our rights too. And so the 15th Amendment was added to the Constitution as a way of saying, yes, everyone has rights, including the right to vote. You cannot restrict people from voting just because, right? So in the South, they were giving them all other rights except the right to vote. But there were no laws that specifically said African Americans cannot vote. Instead, they came up with other ways to prevent African Americans from voting in the South. So violence was one of them. You would actually have like thugs standing outside the doors of the voting station saying, you know, if you come in here to vote, you're not leaving. You get what I'm saying, right? And they would threaten them with violence to prevent them from voting. They also came up with a grandfather clause. And the grandfather clause says this: if your grandfather could vote, then so can you. Simple as that, right? If your grandfather was able to vote, then you also can vote. So that law says nothing about race, right? It's not a racist law because it's just talking about grandparents. But let's think about who people's grandparents were, right? If you were white, then your grandparent was white and your grandparent was able to vote, right? But if you were Black, then your grandparents were also Black and they could not vote because they were enslaved, right? And so even though you are now free, your grandfather couldn't vote, therefore you can't vote. So you see the grandfather clause itself, like when you read it, it just says, oh, well, yeah, anyone can vote if your grandfather could, right? But clearly the way that played out was a very racist thing, right? Because it prevented African Americans from being able to vote because no African American at that time had a grandfather who would have been able to vote because their grandfathers would have been enslaved, right? So it was a very unfair law that only affected African Americans in the South, right? And then they also said, well, okay, you can vote, but you need to prove that you're smart enough to vote. You need to prove that you're an educated citizen, so you need to be able to pass a literacy test. Well, do you remember? Slaves were not allowed to learn to read and write. It was illegal to educate slaves. So now that slaves have their freedom, it's not like they can instantly know how to read and write all of a sudden. So here are all these uneducated, freed people that should have the right to vote, but they can't because they can't pass the literacy test. Furthermore, they wrote the literacy test in such a way that it would be impossible to pass. I couldn't even pass it, right? And so you're like, well, then how did everyone else get to vote? Well, if your grandfather could vote, you didn't need to take the literacy test. Do you see what's going on here? In the South, they were just coming up with their own ways to prevent African Americans from voting, right? And it didn't, the laws themselves didn't call out anything about their race, right? They just said, well, you have to pass a literacy test. Well, if your grandfather could vote, right? But clearly those laws were intended to affect only African Americans. And so even to this day, we still have to be careful about some of the laws that we create, because some laws affect some specific groups of people more than others, right? And so we have to make sure when we're passing laws that the laws we pass are equitable, that they're treating people the way they're supposed to be treated and don't have these other accidental side effects. In the case of voting, it wasn't an accident. They knew full well that they were coming up with ways to prevent African Americans from voting. That is why the United States government passed the 15th Amendment, saying you can't do that anymore. You can't come up with these other little laws that end up restricting the right to vote for any group of people. So the 15th Amendment protected African Americans' rights to vote because the southern states were coming up with their own ways to prevent it from happening. Well, along with that, kind of speaking of the violence that they used, this is when a terrorist organization known as the Ku Klux Klan ended up rising into existence in the South. And their purpose was to fight against giving rights to African Americans. Once again, it goes back to that social structure, right? In the South, before the Civil War, when slavery was legal, things were very clear on the social ladder. Rich white people at the top, poor white people in the middle, slaves at the bottom. And now that those enslaved people have their freedom, the poor white people didn't like being equal to former slaves. And so the Ku Klux Klan rose into existence, and their purpose was to prevent African Americans from having rights. And they used the tools of fear and threat of violence in order to make sure that African Americans stayed at the bottom of the social ladder. And sadly, there are still organizations today that have some of their roots and ties going back to the Ku Klux Klan. There are still people that want to prevent other people from having equal rights and equal opportunities in this country. And it's important to stand up against those and to speak truth out there, right? All right, so there we have it. That kind of wraps up some of those events that occurred during Reconstruction as the United States came back together after the Civil War.